Hello everyone. Today we're looking at women in art and the feminist movement part 1. So this really starts about the 1960s to the 1970s where it really takes off. But it also continues past the 1960s and 1970s. You could argue through the 80s, 90s, and even, to current days. Although when we talk about a lot of the things that we're talking about here that women are targeting in art for women's rights, it kind of feels like we're going back to that again. As much progress that was made has now been actively targeted and attempted to either has been removed or is being targeted to do so. So in many ways, as we talk about this, it feels like these things could very much reapply again to today, unfortunately, because again, as much progress that has been made, the policies and things that have been kind of coming into place have been pushing that progress back, and in some ways potentially even more so than where they were at in the 60s and 70s in certain cases. So it does feel a little weird when, talking about, like I said, these topics, to then sit there and say, and we're right back to before the feminist movement again. So the history of feminist arts, like I said, started around the 1960s. What you have is, and really actually, we probably should go back even further and say the 1950s, because you have the 1960s is kind of the height of that all taking place. But if you're looking at when it started in terms of that, let's go to here. You have, here are topics. I'm getting ahead of it. Like I said, just the topics for what we're looking at. Then here's the historical context. So I said the 1960s, right? But really the 1950s, well, that we have certainly the suburban housewife and that kind of push to get women out of the workforce because at the end of World War II. And so there is a very conservative movement in art. It is certainly in portraying women in the 1950s. You also have other things as well. Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique was written in the late 1950s, and it was the title of this was the problem that has no name. And so one of the things that many women found is that media, when we talked about this, media was bombarding women with this ideal suburban housewife, this conservative kind of nature of the nuclear family. And many women, because of the media and art on TV and film and magazines and advertisements and all kind of popular culture areas, felt that they had to be this ideal suburban housewife. But what was also true around this time is that the most women were now college educated than had ever been before. And so many felt unfulfilled in the role of the suburban housewife, where they didn't find, cooking and cleaning to be exhilarating. The problem was, though, that the society had structured it, and again, art was a huge part of this, and that women should feel happy and fulfilled and grateful for all the technology, for the advances, for their life. And many felt guilty that they didn't feel fulfilled and internalized that and kept that to themselves and got depressed. And so Betty Friedan wrote this, The Feminine Mystique, which talked about this problem that had no name, that all women know about it, even if they can't name it, this feeling of not being fulfilled, of missing something. And that potentially leading to depression, to feeling that something's wrong with you because you're being told and bombarded through all these different images that you should be this way, but you're not. So really, there's in the, like I said, in the 50s, as much as there is that conservative movement, there is also the beginnings of challenging that portrayal of women in society. But then it's the 60s that where the feminist movement takes off. So I guess that's the difference, is we see these beginnings in the 1950s, but the huge push is definitely in the 1960s. And this was a period of a lot of change that takes place, right? You have the civil rights movement that is happening at the same time, and the civil rights movement and feminist movement often intermixed, because women were protesting and pushing for civil rights, and at the same time said, but also that should include, rights for women, for us. And then you also have, I mean, there was just a lot going on. You have the Vietnam War, political protests, you have political assassinations. All of this is essentially was creating social and political change. So there was just a lot of that social and political change that was taking place during this time. So the feminist art movement really looked to change the long-held, like, sociocultural perspectives through art and create a new feminine experience, as well as, I would say, understanding of what it meant to be a woman, but also at the same time, not just experience, but pushing for equality and rights. Right, so that was a key component of it too. The movement was about breaking these boundaries, and both politically and socially, and using art, and not just art, but also so using art to make these political and social changes. But the other component too was also making changes and pushing boundaries by using unique and overlooked materials and styles. So you see a lot of different types of styles, that especially the long held argument of high art or fine art, as this was seen as, acceptable and largely for men, right? And we've been looking at that all semester, that this has been brought up. But then the other part compared to this, I'll move it down here, is the idea of craft, art, design, pop art that we already talked about, right? That there was a challenge to these as equal to the fine arts. Right, so this push, that, especially because these typically were assigned to women, right? Those type of arts were for women, and they were inherently, because they were for women, they were inherently put down as lower and less than the traditional fine art or high art. So challenging that whole system, not just using unique, say we're gonna, use these unique methods or modes or mediums. There's the word I was looking for, the medium. I got the right M, getting through the vocabulary there. Not just using different mediums, but challenging the whole system on what different mediums were, and that there wasn't a hierarchy of acceptable medium, right? Where up until this point, that had always been the case. And then also challenging the absence of women in the global canon of the art world, and trying to also overthrow male domination in historical and cultural documentation of art and artists. So we'll see this at the dinner party. It's probably the best example of this one, of saying, we're going to take a look at how women have been ignored within the historical context and their importance, and we're going to use art to highlight and show that. Because it was a very common aspect, not just in art, but in history, that women were largely ignored, not discussed, except for a few big names. And otherwise, we're not taught, we're not highlighted and showcased. And this then was also reflected in the art world within, the different museums and exhibitions, and women being excluded from those as well, and not being adequately represented in all of this. With this also, of course, there were the goals and challenges of the feminist movement. It looked to create works that expressed women's perspectives, right? That was a huge part of it. This idea of not just highlighting women artists, which was a part of it, but also highlighting women's perspective, as well as at the same time highlighting social inequalities and questioning traditional gender roles. So it really was this kind of full, well-rounded movement that wasn't just about one particular area, but was really looking to break down and dismantle all these different areas and hopefully affect change through the artwork. And we'll see this, I think, the Barbara Kruger and the Guerrilla Girls are very forward in their art. It's very obvious. It's not subtle. That's their goal, like that they're wanting to challenge, they're wanting to change the system. It wasn't just good enough to do the art. They were using the art to change the system, right? And so the Guerrilla Girls, for example, use those unconventional styles and methods we're talking about. They also address the lack of women and minorities in art. But all of this is what we could say for change, right? It wasn't just for the sake of doing it. It was to affect change. There was also a push for challenging the art world norms, and how the art world worked in all aspects. That pushing against consumerism we see with Barbara Kruger here. I shop, therefore I am, right? Challenging that consumeristic society, both just in general, but also in the art world. For example, the Guerrilla Girls are going to challenge the idea. They even have a quote that basically is saying that art shouldn't just be for the 1%. Right? We need to start making art for everyone. Art should be accessible for everyone, but also in consumerism and society as well. And certainly I think some of that comes too from the lack of opportunities for work for women in the art world, and this consumeristic society that emphasized male artists while largely ignoring, if not outright rejecting, female artists and stuff like that. But also pushing against gallery representation and demanding more representation in the galleries for the galleries to acknowledge women artists, to acknowledge the disparity between those what have been shown, and to challenge the patriarchal structure and the biases within the art establishment as a whole, right? This whole idea of emphasizing that it has been a male-dominated system, and that male-dominated system has created implicit bias that is, we could put it this way, that influences women's. I ran out of space here. I was trying to see if I could move it. Opportunity. Sorry, that's small there. But this idea that because of how everything has been created and so shaped, that it's created this implicit bias against female artists. I mean, you straight up had a gallery saying that they don't display women's art, or barely. You had a few women just as kind of the token women artist, but only because they felt like they had to, rather than for the sake of that women had a right to have their art displayed just as much as men. They're also creating spaces for women is a big thing, creating communities and groups to help women, to help each other, right? The idea that women, if the art world and galleries and communities were going to reject women artists, then women need to come together and support each other in these causes, and essentially make their own way, if possible. The importance of all of this is these contributions lay the foundation for the development and growth of feminist art practices and theories. Again, we're still not at equality today. And as I mentioned at the beginning, unfortunately, we're moving backwards. So, if I'd done this a few years ago, my statement would be that they made a ton of progress. There's still progress to be made. It is still not equal, but the push and the changes and the movement that took place in the feminist movement had a huge significance on expanding women's opportunities in the art world. Again, that would have been a few years ago. Now I'm going to say it did, and now we're moving back towards before this period again. So it's a little depressing when you kind of talk about it like that, but it is the truth. It is what is happening. Women's art, women's recognition of women in general is being denied. Women's rights are actively being stripped, and there's more to potentially come. So it's hard when you're looking at what some of these women artists fought for and pushed against, and then to realize that you could use, well, look, there's one with Barbara Kruger that like I looked at when I was putting it into the PowerPoint, and I was thinking about it going, you could take this artwork and use it for today and no one would know that it was created, in the late 60s, early 70s. Actually, no, I think that the one I'm thinking of is in the 90s, but still, right? Oh, this was created in the 90s, but I could put, have that go out and march with that artwork that she created, and people would assume it was custom made for what's going on today, right? So that tells you something in terms of what's been going on, how that's been impacting things, and as we kind of look at up to today, there still are some certain opportunities and changes that are still in play. Women's artists certainly have more opportunities than they ever did before, but when you're looking at all this other kind of push to remove that, it's at risk. And I think that's important to acknowledge and recognize, that as much as these things had been pushed and did change for a while, it's all kind of at risk at the moment. And it will be interesting to see and pay attention to how art, if you look at protest posters today, right? As people go on these marches and protests, people are making posters. How can art be utilized again? Because art is such a powerful movement. And as we're going to see within this lecture and the next one, it can impact change. It does impact change. It can be very powerful. And for example, like many of the women we're talking about in these next couple lectures they're still alive and working today. The Guerrilla Girls are still active today. And it will be interesting to see if we see, they're around in the art scene, but I think the average person isn't aware of them. It'll be interesting to see if they kind of move up in awareness and popularity, where people start to recognize them outside of the kind of niche art world, if you will. All right, so the first woman we're going to look at, and this one, Judy Chicago, and specifically we're going to look at the Woman House and then the Dinner Party. She's often described as the founder of the feminist art movement, and certainly she plays an important role in setting the stage for other women to come after her. And what's interesting, in as much as she is this kind of foundational piece, sorry, something just fell. I'll have to go check that in just a second. As much as she's this foundational piece for the feminist art movement, the reception of her work was tepid. At best, she has more acclaim and more recognition and more just general praise now today about her importance and the kind of key role she played. But at the time when this was first being created and produced, it definitely, while there were some that were very enthusiastic about her artwork, there were a lot of people that kind of were like, that's probably that tepid kind of just style. So interesting to look at how to also people's perceptions of art and the movement and feminist art changed over time from kind of looking at it as something that was just kind of okay to something now that is like, this is a core foundational piece in the beginning of the movement that kind of became the backbone for other women to push for the feminist movement in art. So Judy Chicago, that was actually not her name to begin with. Well, Judy was, but Chicago was not her last name. She actually changed her last name. She claimed that she was removing the patriarchal association because, so, right, one of the things that, where that comes from with that, right, in here is that changed her last name to Chicago. So she was born in Chicago, and so she changed her last name to Chicago. Both technically, I suppose, just by birth, but also by marriage, throughout a huge chunk of history, really until like the that's the feminist movement, really. I was gonna say it's not the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. There's a thing called femme couvert. And what it was for married women. And there's femme sole too. So sole was if widow or single, if you never got married. But mostly it was targeted towards widows. But when you got married, you became femme couvert. And technically, in some ways, you were femme couvert under your father's authority until you either were old enough to be single and not married, or a widow if your husband died. But femme couvert, when you got married, what it was is that basically all your identity became your husband's. And there were some changes that took place in the 1920s. So that's why I started to say earlier and then said, well, not exactly. So the women's right to vote changed some of femme couvert, but there were other areas where it didn't completely go away until the feminist movement. And basically what it was is that your entire identity becomes your husband's when you get married. Women didn't have any, again, this is why the 1920s, women didn't have any political identity outside of their husbands until the 1920s. But in previous years for that. So essentially, and they saw this like in the Revolutionary War, for example, husbands who stayed loyalists with the British and women who stayed behind and wanted to be patriots. They actually went to court because women ended up losing their house and their property as branded as loyalists. And they went to court and took them to court and said, hey, we should have our property because while my husband was a loyalist, we stayed behind. I taught my children patriot values. I supported the patriots, and in all cases, there's like 3 court cases that this went through that we have. The courts ruled that no, because you were married, your political identity is your husband's, no matter what your actions are. But it wasn't just political identity. Money earned was your husband's. Your name was your husband. So, for example, until through the 50s, and actually I would argue, I saw this still, or heard about this, and you saw it in films sometimes too, like through the 80s, really. When people got married, after they got married, they were usually introduced as, now introducing Mr. and Mrs. John Smith. And formal letters that people would write, you were taught to write them that way, Mr. and Mrs. John Smith. So what happens to the woman's name? Her name becomes Mrs. John Smith. She loses her entire identity and name to her husband's, right? She's now just Mrs. That's the entire identity. The rest of her name is her husband's name, John Smith. Now, obviously, she still has her first name, but in the formal setting, she would be addressed as Mrs. John Smith. Formal letters, you were instructed to address them as Mrs. John Smith. And that was all part of that femme covert. And in fact, one of the other things that was present in femme covert until like the 1900s was that you were also criminally not always liable, with the belief that essentially if if you committed a crime, that you didn't have your own identity to that, and therefore your husband could also be held responsible for that crime. And that now, that I think goes away by like the late 1880s, early 1900s. But the point being is that aspects of femme covert, for example, women couldn't get their own credit card, or even sometimes a bank account without their husband's or father's signature and approval. And like women couldn't get their credit card in their name through the 1970s. That's a more recent thing, which is also something that a bill was introduced recently in an attempt to actually remove women's financial freedoms. So again, these changes that are being threatened today, that had kind of long been thought to not be something that would come back. So she saw this, right? Her last name as either being her father's or her husband's. It was part of this patriarchal structure. So she said she was overthrowing that patriarchal structure and was going to give herself a new last name, which was Chicago. Though, long story for why it ended up Chicago, but I think it's an interesting understanding what she meant by the patriarchal associations. It's all the last name, right? Even if you kept your maiden name, was still wrapped up in patriarchal structure if your mom took your father's last name when they got married. So either way, whether through maiden name or through married name, it still is connected to that patriarchal structure in that system. But she founded the first feminist studio art course at Fresno State College. So that was a big, huge deal to have an art course on feminism and a studio for that at the college. And there was also a lot of in her artwork, we'll see there's kind of this central aspect of vaginal imagery in her art, which was a common theme kind of in the feminist art movement in general. One of the themes. It was not the only theme by any means. And some women rejected that and didn't want to focus on that part at all. Others wanted to embrace it and highlight the female body and basically kind of take it back from the male representations that had so long been prolific in art. So that was certainly part of it. So she teamed up with Miriam Shapiro, which we're going to also look at, and they created the art program at the California Institute of Arts in Valencia. And this eventually led to the communal art installation known as Woman House, which was a house with different rooms. And they renovated this rundown building in Hollywood and designed installations and art installations in each of the rooms. And each of the rooms installations had to do with women, and in some way or another. So I'll show the pictures in a minute. So one was the kitchen. In the kitchen, there was a whole bunch of breast-shaped, styled, like eggs, or not egg shape, but it was breast-shaped. Basically, breasts that were put all over the kitchen. That's the best way to describe it. I'll show it in just a second here. They also used Woman House as a way to bring other female artists in and collaborate. Again, that collaboration was an important part of that, as well as working with students. So the Woman House became not only like a common theme throughout the whole house of each room representing femininity and women and that kind of push for freedom of representation of women in the feminist movement, but also was a way to have not just collaboration, but mentorship with students who also helped work on it. And it kind of was a long-lasting project that different rooms could change over time as well. So in it, if you see, here we go to it. So here's the kitchen, which you can see these breasts that were just placed all over the kitchen. Then they had the bathroom, and in the bathroom, the key centerpiece was a garbage with what looks like period products, like pads and stuff like that, with blood on it. And it was meant to be, it was essentially meant to be in your face, right? It was meant, we're not going to hide the aspects of womanhood, right? And part of that is menstruation and what comes with that. And this thing that often was hidden and kept secret and pushed to the side instead was, we're going to make it up front and center. We're going to make it obvious. We're going to make it slightly uncomfortable, because they wanted to basically highlight the physical realities of a woman's body. Right? And so you have, thus why you have these large breasts all over the place, why you have a garbage can with, it's fake blood, right? It's paint, but period products with blood on it overflowing in the garbage, one on the ground, and then the boxes and products up top, so that it was very much meant to be that aspect of it. You also have a room with this is the, we'll say, design and craft, with this lattice, kind of like the sewing for like the dowels and stuff like that. This was very much the idea of what was seen as woman's art or work, right? And so then it created this whole room with it, and almost creating this spider web like style, that is not, and this type of work is super delicate, and intricate and requires a lot of hand-eye coordination, but it was always been, this type of artwork is always seen as a woman's work, that's sewing, needlework, crafting, and design, and of course was always seen as, again, challenging and bringing up this idea of elevating the lower arts, if you will, and challenging that kind of system of what is craft versus fine art, and that essentially they weren't separate things, or that there could be high art as well. So Woman House was essentially the catalyst for the Los Angeles women's artist community, and eventually led to the founding of the Los Angeles Women's Building in 1973. Her like activism or artwork culminated really in the design and execution of probably the most well publicized work, which was the dinner party. And again, this was both Woman House, although I would argue Woman House was not as publicized and was more about the community and the mentorship and expression for the women, although, you know, it was shown off. It didn't have the same presentation that the dinner party had. And the dinner party was definitely for a larger audience, where, again, I feel like Woman House was, sure, could be for a larger audience, but wasn't, it was more internal, right? It was for the community first. And then if it reached a larger audience, great. Dinner party was for the larger audience, and it was super publicized, and it's a huge piece. The amount that went into this, if you watch the video that I put in that that talks about the essentially like the amount of like research that just went into the people, let alone the artwork behind it. So even before you get to the artwork, the research was crazy for it. But the reception was, again, as I mentioned, just kind of in many ways. and has grown in accolades and recognition over time, and is now very much recognized as this foundational piece for the feminist art movement and the importance behind it. But that necessarily wasn't always recognized when it first came out. Nonetheless, it still was super well publicized, and for like an artwork by a woman artist, to the amount of publicity and awareness was significant for the time. So that certainly is important, because one of the struggles that women artists have still to this day, but even more so back then, was the being able to have their art be seen and recognized, right? It's one thing to produce the art, but if you can't get it shown, people aren't going to know about it. And so then if it's just a small group that know about it, your ability to have an impact on the art world, to sell your art, is minimal. But if you can get it out there, you certainly then are going to have a lot more opportunities. And that's always something that women artists have struggled with throughout the eras that we've looked at, because of that bias towards male artists compared to female artists. This was still in Southern California. The dinner party was inspired by the Last Supper paintings, and in the video again that I having you look at and watch, they show some of the sketches. They kind of sketched it out. They had a connection to that idea of like, what if we do something like the Last Supper, but reinterpret it from a woman's perspective, and not just perspective, but what I would argue is recognition of women in history. Right, so it's from women's perspective about women in history, to highlight and showcase all of these women that have that the average person is not aware of. Again, probably a few of the names people were, because there's always like the big names, but that there were plenty of women on there that the average person wouldn't be aware of, because they had been pushed aside. They'd been hidden from history. And so part of this goal was to highlight these women in history and use art to show how women were central to history, to show that women were important. I mean, it's one of the things when you look at like including women in history classes, it's important to have them not just as helpers or the big names, but that to recognize that a lot of people don't know that women have played central roles in major historical events throughout history, throughout the world. And so often, because it's written from this male patriarchal perspective, when history then gets written and taught, the women just their contributions, which were central to the success of many of these things that took place, they're just not mentioned. And so that was all trying to target that. So the dinner party ends up being exhibited in the San Francisco Museum in 1978, and then traveled around various parts of the United States, ending up in the Brooklyn Museum in 1980. Chicago specifically said about the artwork, "When I thought about paintings of the Last Supper, I became amused by the notion of doing a sort of reinterpretation of that tall male event from the point of view of those who had traditionally been expected to prepare the food, then silently disappear from the picture, or in this case, the picture plane. Before long, I became very focused upon creating a series of plates that could constitute a visual narrative of Western civilization as seen through women's accomplishments." So she's talking about, right, which was true, is that women, right, the idea of a dinner party in the past, women were expected to make the dinner party, but not sit down at the dinner table of the dinner party. I mean, it depends on the culture. Some women could, some not. But a lot of societies, women, made the food, but did not participate in sitting at the table if it was a party with other men. And so she's saying she thought she liked that idea of reinterpreting that whole concept from the point of view of women who largely were not, while they made it, did not get to participate in it. And then it expanded to be a focus on a narrative of women's accomplishments in Western civilization. So the artwork was composed of a super large triangle, as you can see here, which definitely has that kind of a vaginal reference loosely, as that shape is often used in much of her artwork. And it was meant to be a symbol of female power as well. It was very large, 48 feet on each side, had a raised platform with 2,300 hand-cast tiles, and 999 women's names significant in history are written on the thing. And each plate was about a specific woman. And the place settings, and here, let's go here so you can see it a little more close up. So you had all of this needlework that was done on the runners. They had over 100 skilled needleworkers help participate in this. And then you had these china plates, and each plate, and so you can see the name. So the names were embroidered on each of the place settings, if you will. And then the colors, the subject, the artwork was connected to, along with on the back side, so you can kind of see it here on the opposite side. All of this was connected to that particular woman. So they did research on all these women that were important women in history, and then curated the artwork to represent what that woman was known for, what she had done, her accomplishments. It's super impressive in that sense of being one of the earliest to be such, like, to have such a large recognition of women in history. It's one of the earliest to do that, and not just with art, but just in general, and then specifically in the art world especially. And it certainly makes a powerful statement about, when you look at it visually, this massive piece, you know, how there were so many women that were involved in history and were important to history. And then you get this kind of visually stunning individual place setting that represents the work of that woman and what she did. So you have a variety of women. Some of them that were selected were for early goddesses. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Christine de Pizan, Artemisia Sojourner Truth, Margaret Sanger, Georgia O'Keeffe, who people would have known her. Those were just some of the women that were on the place sets. And again, they were meant to reflect their specific achievements and experiences as historical figures, as well as educate women about their contributions in history. Of course, ultimately with the goal of trying to spark social change through art, and in perhaps recognition of that, both in the term of social change in the art world, of reevaluating the idea of what craft media, right, and artwork was, that which was the needlework, the embroidery, even like the fact of it being on plates, right? This type of thing that would have been connected to, you know, the lower art style, and that would have been practiced by women and largely barred from consideration as fine art. And so she wanted and hoped that this would spark social change and conversation about women's roles and place in society, as well as the types and styles of art that could be elevated to also be seen as equal to any other officially fine art or high art that existed before that. Again, it did have initially ambivalent reception within the art world, but it was shown in Los Angeles in 1996 in an exhibition to provide historical context for the work, and was far more appreciated and well received by that point in time in 1996. So again, while the initial reception was kind of lukewarm or ambivalent, over time, this artwork has not only endured, but has been elevated and just recognized with the value and the impressive nature of it and the importance of the artwork within feminist art. All right, so next is Miriam Shapiro, who was actively involved with Judy Chicago. And she contributed to the movement of pattern painting or pattern and decoration, as well as in general to the feminist art movement. And then again, worked directly with Judy Chicago as well. She was born in 1923 and trained at Hunter College, and then received her MA in Fine Arts from the University of Iowa in the 1950s. So, went to school for art, both with her bachelor's and master's degree. She worked a lot in abstract expressionist, I can speak, style, with veiled references to the human figure. So it was there, very subtle. It was not as obvious as Judy Chicago's, whose wasn't even the most explicit for human figure, but was meant to have these loose connections that one could or could not see in many cases. She had collaborated in the Woman House on one of the rooms was the doll house, and also from there expanded to other areas. One of her earliest is this. It was called the Big Ox #1, and this was in 1968. And this painting was this large mural. It was very large, and of course, the dominant color is the orange, but framed with pink, and it forms the essentially ox. There's the O, there's the X. So in it, that's where the name and the connection comes to from that. And this idea of certainly having this style again that was not traditionally seen as fine art and challenging that kind of style, and pushing for especially with the use of pink and the color, this idea, and also even a little bit of the idea of a woman's private parts there with the shape, again, very subtle, but it was more like hinting at, right, than some who we'll see were very forward about it. But this idea of challenging both that kind of what is fine art versus is unexpected style and design, and what could be seen as elevated to that. She also again moved to also fabric collage and painting, and she worked on a series of collaborations, which incorporated reproductions of works of art by women artists in the past. And this one, I think, so reproductions of women's works of art from the past. This definitely, you can see, has a connection to the dinner party in a different manner, right? Again, looking to the past and trying to bring forward and highlight and showcase what women had done, right? And that definitely is a part of that. One of her probably best known pattern paintings was the Barcelona fan. It was also very large. She did a lot of massive artwork. It was 12 feet across, 6 feet high, and it's composed of these alternating light, right, and dark bands or strips that are meant to create this continuous pattern and rhythmic movement across the surface. And then you have this semicircular shape of the fan. So, and of course, why it's called a fan is because it has that same look as the fans that you would open up. I mean, people just use battery-powered fans now, but before those existed, you had wooden or fabric fans that you flipped open. That's my sound for flipping open. But you can kind of flick it open, and when it's open, it creates a semicircle. And because the fabric of the fan or the paper of the fan was often attached to, so like these, the darker ones kind of represent the wood pieces or bone pieces that was the backbone of the fan, and then this kind of represents the fabric of the fan, and it looks exactly like those hand fans essentially from them. And this idea of unity that starts from the core to the outer edges is maintained with those alternating color strips, as well as the pattern that is repeating. And it's meant to create this continuity of elements from edge to edge, right? So it's almost creating this kind of sense that it doesn't, there's no start or ending in it. She said the fan, the form of the fan was also meant to represent the unfolding of woman's consciousness. In the idea of, right, when the fan opens, that's also when women's consciousness and awareness opens up as well. So this one also, because of it with the fabric and the pattern, it was also challenging again the decorative arts versus high art or fine arts, and connecting, of course, to the feminist movement in the process, all which was trying to reshape the idea of craft in feminist art as a whole. All right, the next one we're going to look at is Cindy Sherman. She had a whole bunch of, she kind of titled all of hers like Untitled series. There was Untitled Film Stills, Untitled Series. She is most known for her stage photographs. So we were looking at, like, you know, different type of mediums and stuff up to this point. Here we have another one with photography, and this idea of looking at the idea of imagery and how it manipulates the reality of women's lives. And I would argue how people interpret it differently. She intentionally keeps things ambiguous. And what's interesting, and you could kind of do a whole thing on how male artists and art critics interpreted her photographs versus how women artists and critics interpreted her photographs. So that the intentional ambiguity was done to highlight how essentially women are viewed and portrayed based on gender and expectations in that process. But then also, again, how it manipulates based on these expectations, which really you could tie back to the 1950s and the suburban housewife and ideal, and how that very much shaped a lot of that. So she was born in New Jersey and raised in Long Island. And these untitled film stills were carefully staged black and white photos using herself most often as the person photographed. And she changes her appearance in these different ones to create a frozen moment and somewhat of an implied continuous film narrative. And in fact, numbered them like number 1, number 2, number 3. And while not every single one of them, a lot of them looked like if you put them together and viewed them in order, that you were seeing the stills of a film. And that was intentional, of creating this implied film narrative through the stills in that process. So we could put that implied film, stills, and narrative. And then I will put intentionally, because I mentioned it and I want to make sure it's on there, ambiguous for interpretation. I'm running out of room again. We'll go over here, based on gender. There we go. The style of these black and white photographs had a kind of film noir structure, which film noir was this film style where it was meant to be kind of mysterious and uncertain, that women were sometimes the seductress, but not always, but certainly mysterious. I used that word already, but that's probably the best word for it. And she very intentionally structured around this film noir style. And here's some of the other ones that you can see in this style. So you have, and one of course the themes with this are certainly domestic as one, just womanhood in general. Um, this idea of also the kind of, as I mentioned, the ambiguous scenarios or situations. So it was meant ambiguity and location and situation. So this idea that you know, just from looking at this, you do have some are more like there's the domestic kind of structure to it, but the other one, she's just in the city, and then here she's looks like she's in a desert in a tree, right? But also the idea of femininity. And then if you look at how she's posing, right, it's always kind of this serious look, which was intentional. It wasn't to be happy and cheery, meant because this creates that mystery, right? What's going on, and it very much has this film style still. Like if you would go back and look at film noir and take out in the film the stills from it, you would probably have some of these scenes that would look very similar to that. But male critics often perceived this persona that she was creating in these stills as the girl, right, an object of male desire, while women critics often saw the images as more of a critique on stereotypes, such as the domestic stereotype or femininity, or the stereotypes of film noir as sexualized or mysterious. So that again, that challenging that different interpretation based on gender, on how women were viewed, was part of that. She does a drastic change in, well, not drastic, it looks drastic, similar kind of idea, but she has a significant change in the 1980s where she begins to use color and larger scale images. And here are some. Some of her first ones were inspired by the Playboy, I can't speak today, centerfolds. They were meant to be these large life-size figures, specifically that are meant to be unsettling and disturbing, right? And so you can see that in the makeup in the face, in the overly tanned, significantly over tanned individual. All of that was meant to be makes up you uncomfortable, to feel like, you know, something was wrong with it, this kind of uncanny kind of feeling, right, where it's not real. And this certainly worked, I think, with, like, she did a Hollywood series, which is like this one, and Society Portraits is this one, high society, like, you know, like the wealthy. And it's critiquing those societies. The other ones, which I don't have one here. Why can't I say Playboy centerfolds, which again are this idea of sexualization of women. So in those ones, they're fully clothed, but they're kind of posing in the poses that the centerfolds did, but in a really awkward way. So again, the whole idea is meant to make you feel uncomfortable, while critiquing and challenging with these distorted images and stuff like that, how women are portrayed. So definitely it has a very, very different look from her earlier work. right? But why I hesitate, why I keep adding that bar there, but why I hesitate to say that she drastically changed gears is that ambiguity and the idea of trying to make you think and question is still there. It's just she does it in a very different way when she shifts in the 80s to the color photos. And then of course the other difference is this sense of unsettling, disturbing, uncanny, distorted views that she doesn't. There's no distortion in the film noir style of untitled stills. But I think the key point that she was trying to get to in these is still there. That hadn't changed. Just the way that the mode and method of portraying that is very different. So that was the hesitation with that. All right, the next artist that we're going to look at is Barbara Kruger, and specifically how she utilizes popular media to make her point, and hers are much more forward. So we looked at like Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, and Cindy Sherman's artwork. I don't know. Cindy Sherman's wasn't subtle. So Judy Chicago, Mary Shapiro's work was more subtle. Cindy's was, somewhere in between compared to Barbara and the Guerrilla Girls, right? So we're shifting over now to in your face. You can't misinterpret what they're trying to say here, or not. It would be hard to. I suppose there's a few with Barbara's that you could question what's the meaning behind it, but a lot of her artwork is in your face. It's very obvious the point that she's trying to get across, and the Guerrilla Girls are intentionally in your face as well. So we're shifting. That's kind of the shift here that we're seeing with the next two that we're going to look at. They're much more forward and upfront, and the messages that they're trying to portray in their art. Kruger's work addressed issues of power, dynamic sexual politics, hidden meanings in popular media, and images from popular media, films, television, magazines. What she does for her artwork is she actually manipulates imagery from that she finds in popular culture, and then uses those pictures with brief, pithy texts that are in large, bold text, often with red, to make it stand out, to be bold, so that you can't miss it, right? And this appropriation of images is certainly a trend that becomes popular and used, and also, of course, is meant to reinforce and highlight feminist ideals and concepts. So what's interesting about her background is that she studied photography first at the Parsons School of Design, and then she was first and foremost a graphic designer for a magazine, which was with the company Condé Nast Publications, and the magazine that she worked on was Mademoiselle. And so it's not surprising where she gets her influence in. Her job was the media layout and formulas that were used in photo montages to draw people's attention, right? The whole point of laying out that stuff in magazines was to get readers' attention and hold their attention. So her background makes perfect sense why this is the direction of her artwork, because it fits so perfectly with what she ends up doing, and she had the background and knowledge of how to effectively employ that and utilize that and lay it out because magazines, right, they have the photos and they always use the text like this to have their headlines, to have key quotes, to make some points. You put some images together to make your point that goes with the article in the magazine, right? And that was what she did. So it makes sense that then this is the direction she did that. And so, this is by the 80s, she was not working at the magazine anymore, instead was doing this artwork that is still used today. And was meant to, again, you take images in popular culture, manipulate them, enlarge them, crop them, put the boldface type and the red color on it. They were often, you can't see in the pictures here, but they were often very large, billboards style, large, 4 feet tall, 6 feet wide works with bright red frames, again, to draw your attention to the work. She said that her work was with a specific intent of including women in her audience. I want to address, this is her quote, I want to address difference that leads to gender distinctions. I'm not a separatist. I'm not a utopian. So the idea that she's wanting to bring to light those differences between women and men, and issues in society, and problems with society. Her artwork has received a lot of wide recognition in the art world since its first appearance. And she definitely, like, her artwork is very powerful in communicating concepts directly. Again, as I mentioned, both her and the Grill Girls are in your face about their points. And meant to, of course, impact social change. That's a huge part of this, right? So this one here, we don't need another hero, right? So it shows this girl with the boy showing his flexing how strong she is, while she, feels how strong she is. And this is a very much a critique of, we don't need another male hero, right? Women don't need another male hero. Pretty straightforward, in your face, makes its point. This is probably her most well-known one. Your body is a battleground. And then you have the negative on one side, right? And then the photo on the other with the text. This one was huge. The original image was over 9 feet. It ends up getting put on posters and was used in marches and stuff like that. So this one was massively, we'll say, majorly reproduced and into posters. It was a political slogan. It was meant to highlight, again, that the fight over women's bodily autonomy. Where it was used a lot was in the abortion rights, the March on Washington in 1992, when Roe v. Wade was. So Roe v. Wade was already in place, but in 1992, the Supreme Court was hearing a case, and it was at risk of being repealed, which of course didn't happen, but then recently did happen. And this was a huge march. There's over 700,000 people marching. It was one of the largest marches at the time. And the march was to encourage the Supreme Court to uphold Roe v. Wade. And this is when I was talking about that you could use this image today, and it seems like it was made for today. You wouldn't, which is not a good thing, because it shows the problems of how we've regressed. But it is, not only is it kind of timeless in the sense of, at least where we are today, in the style, that it still looks like it's modern in its creation, but the message is still incredibly relevant today. And no one would bat an eye thinking that someone had just made this sign for a march against, when the Supreme Court was making that decision, or for protesting against the end of Roe v. Wade that has now happened with this. And so, again, it's meant to, a lot of her artwork was rooted in gender politics. It was specifically trying to highlight the actual bodies of real women. This one was used, as I mentioned, to support abortion rights on the march, trying to encourage the Supreme Court to uphold Roe v. Wade. And it was meant, her artwork is meant to have direct engagement with issues of politics, gender, and power. that specifically are targeting women's rights, and is meant to be used to question, challenge, and change those issues, which is also why it's so in your face, right? You can have subtle stuff, say you want it to impart change, but if it goes over everyone's head, it's harder to do so. If it's in your face and impactful, it's more likely to push and have influence in making that social and political change. Here's another one. This is critiquing women's beauty and the expectations of beauty. So we'll put beauty and the expectations of beauty, which also includes like products and time and also the mental aspect of it, right? Never perfect enough. And this also is targeting consumerism of those beauty products, right? The idea that no matter what women do, they're constantly always trying to add things, and it has all these words into it, right? Women, no matter what they're doing and adding to their bodies or changing or shaping, it's never perfect enough. And all of that's critiquing society. We could put that too. It's critiquing general society with this idea of vanity, gossip, fear, picture, moment, kiss, change, will, etc. Like this idea of it's almost like it's clever because it's like the curls, as well as the other things in the hair, but especially the curls. It's like it reminds me of those like brain pictures where like there'll be, an outline, and then it's like a person's brain, and it has like all the written words of what's going on in their brain, or what different sections of the brain, or what men's brains look like, what women's brains look like, and it's a joke about like what you think about all the time. This reminds me of that kind of style too. The curlers almost represent like what's going on in women's mind due to the pressure of and expectations of society and beauty and products and all of that plays a role in it. Here's another one that she has, which this is also another one that you could totally use today. This is Untitled Questions and from 1991, and you could totally use this today and it would be just as relevant. Look for the moment when pride becomes contempt. Who is free to choose? Who is beyond the law? Who is healed? Who is housed? Who speaks? Who is silenced? Who salutes longest? Who prays loudest? Who dies first? Who laughs last? Right, and this is meant to make you think. It's meant to make you meant to question what's going on in society. And again, unfortunately, you could definitely take this and I think use this today, and no one would know that it wasn't created for today's issues in that. All right, and then lastly, we're looking at the Guerrilla Girls. The Guerrilla Girls were created as a group of women artists and art professionals who wanted to fight discrimination in the art world. That they said that we're the conscience of the art world, counterparts to the mostly male traditions of anonymous do-gooders like Robin Hood, Batman, and the Lone Ranger. That was a quote from it. They were essentially a female collective who wanted to remain anonymous in order to fully express themselves without fear of repercussion, and challenge traditions held in society and the art world by wearing the gorilla masks and naming themselves after famous dead women. So the artists themselves actually wore gorilla masks when they went out in public. When this is the best way to think of this is like street art, right? They would go and like, they do in New York with posters, and they're based in New York, where you take the roller paint and the clear paint, right? And you slap a poster on the wall, and then you roll the clear paint glue or whatever it is over it to stick it. They were doing that. They were plastering their posters all over the place like the other street art kind of thing. And what I'd almost say like underground street art in many ways was the kind of style. But it was also meant to be seen as edgy, as challenging authority and expectations. So again, the women wore the gorilla mask, and I'll explain how that kind of developed with that. But they also start putting the gorilla mask on some of their artwork as well. So it's both. The women artists always wear gorilla masks still to this day in anything public that they do to hide their identity, thus taking also famous dead women's names. They become, that's my artist name when I'm in this role. But it also shows up in the artwork itself. So the posters for Gorilla Girl posters first appeared in 1985 through Lower Manhattan. And the goal was to target art galleries and areas that had influence in the art world. And it was, and so you can see it has that kind of pop art style to it as well. It has a little bit of the magazine style like Barbara Kruger's, but with a lot of text. There's very much this sense of a text-based aspect of art that was, again, to be in your face. First, they want because a whole lot of their stuff is about data and facts, and they said we want it to be explicit. We want there to be no confusion about the critique. They wanted it to be obvious, right? First, they want to take away a woman's right to choose. Now they're censoring art, right? And then you have the Mona Lisa with the famous kind of what looks like the fig leaf over her mouth that usually was what the fig leaves were on the Sistine Chapel were. When the Sistine Chapel was created, the figures were nude, and then later they had someone go back over and censor the nudes by painting fig leaves over the private parts. So imagine that's your job. Like, hey, you're going to work. You've been selected to paid to work on the Sistine Chapel. And you're like, my big break. And like, yeah, all we need you to do is paint fig leaves over everyone's private. And you're like, oh, okay. That was someone's job to do late after it had been created. So the fig leaves weren't put on it when the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling artwork and stuff was first created. That was added later. So that's kind of referencing that. It was initially formed by 7 women in response to, and I think that I have that one here with that. Or maybe it was in, right here. Formed by 7 women in response to the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition of International Survey of Recent Painting and Sculpture. There were 165 artists that were invited to this exhibition on the International Survey of Painting and Sculpture. Only 13 were women, and only 8 were artists of color, and none of those artists were women. Right, so they decided first what they were going to do is they actually wanted to protest. And it wasn't just them. There was a whole group of women artists that started protesting with picket signs without the gorilla masks across the street from the Museum of Modern Art. And these 7 women that formed this group, they were some of the women that were in the protest. There were lots of other women picketing against this. But the 7 women were part of this. And what they said is, they're like, what we noticed is that people either completely ignored us, didn't care, or were annoyed and upset with us disrupting them. So instead of getting their point across, instead of making their point clear about the disparity and inequality of the exhibit, they just had people be less on their side because of this. So because of this, they decided to form the Gorilla Girls, which were, what they said is they needed to be more media savvy to garner attention. And they wanted to do that through bold advertising style graphics and text, as well as humor and somewhat edgy style, right? And then they targeted our galleries and museums. And this worked. This actually got people interested. It got galleries afraid to be called out by the Gorilla Girls. And people weren't pissed at them. And so the idea kind of was like their artwork, they'd post these things, right? And they'd plaster them near the galleries. They put sticker decals on the windows. But they weren't marching and protesting in front of the galleries that what they saw as what irritated people. Instead, they did it in a way that was bold and drew attention, but was also funny at times, but was also serious and full of facts and information that was hard for people to deny, right? So a lot of their artwork is very, very heavy text-based because of that. But humor was definitely important. The goal was to make their serious message accessible and engaging to everyone. Thus, the bold, straightforward, we're not going to be subtle about what we're doing, right? And their artwork is often seen as protest art, right? Artwork that's created for protest. They just did it without the picketing and the marching and that type of thing. But in part, all of their themes were protesting inequality and issues as they saw it about women in the art world, as well as eventually expanding to social and political issues as well. So their initial start was the galleries and museums and the unfair nature of wages, of exhibits, of being a woman artist. And then as time went on, they evolved to also doing a lot more about social and political reform that was targeting women as well. So in this one, the advantages of being a woman artist. This is tongue-in-cheek here, right? Working without the pressure of success. Not having to be in shows with men because they weren't in shows, right? Not having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs. Right? The idea again that like, oh, I get this all tongue-in-cheek. These were not advantages, right? These were things that women had to deal with. But they're making it tongue-in-cheek. Knowing your career might pick up after you're 80. Being reassured that whatever kind of art you make, it will be labeled feminine. Not being stuck in a tenured teaching position. Seeing your ideas live on in the work of others. Where, again, that's reference to women's work being stolen by men. Having the opportunity to choose between career and motherhood. Not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits. Having more time to work when your mate dumps you for someone younger. Being included in revised versions of art history. Not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius. Getting your picture in the art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. All right, so again, this kind of tongue-in-cheek of pointing out all the things that women have to go through or denied, and then joking about it being an advantage. Oh, look how great is it that we don't have to worry about the pressure of success, because it's hard for women to have that success with that. A lot of their artwork, while expressing observations, concerns, and ideas regarding various social topics about women and the art world, like this one that I just read for you, their art was always centered around data collection, numbers, with the belief that, again, data and numbers and information made a strong impact with that bold text and imagery mixed with humor that people would have a hard time denying, right? They couldn't just ignore it. Once they read it, it would be stuck with them because of the humor, because of the bold print, because of the stylized art. This was a very this one was definitely one that was talked about a lot when they made this one. They had several. In 1985, they printed a poster showing the salary gap in the art world between men and women. And specifically, it highlighted that many people, like how significant it was. It said women in America earn only 2/3 of what men do. Women artists are only 1/3 of what men do. And again, they often put these towards galleries and artworks and stuff with that. But this one here that we're looking at right now was definitely one that caused a lot of response, if you will, with that. This one was with the Metropolitan Museum poster. That they'd actually use the data that they have here from what they had these weenie and banana counts. So it was counts, is what they called them. And of course, it was basically how many naked or nudes, I should just say, how many naked paintings and pictures or nudes were there. And so they would go into the museums and they would count how many nudes, how many male nudes, how many female nudes. And this was the weenie banana count kind of thing. And so this data comes from one of those early counts that they did, which of course was meant to note the ratio of male to female subjects, as well as the ratio of male to female artists represented in the collections, as well as the number of nudes in that. So the question here is, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? And this was critiquing, of course, that women artists were not being portrayed and represented in the Met Museum. But then you have the statistics from these weenie counts. Less than 5% of artists in the modern art section are women, but 85% of the nudes are female, right? And then what they did, which was clever, here you have the gorilla mask, but they put it on top of an image of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres's painting, which was well known. This is one of the more. This is one of the. Well, it's in the image of it. It's of that. It's the style, the pose, the feather duster thing, minus the head. Right. They basically took this most famous female nude painting, and transformed it with the gorilla mask and it being a photograph and stuff. But it was from that. They basically like, we're going to take exactly that image and that style of this most famous. Any artist, any museum is going to know this artwork of this nude portrait, and we're going to take that and then we're going to stick a gorilla head on it, and then ask the question: what, women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Because right, well, only 5% of the artists are women, 85% of the nudes, and that they're showing there. That the point being, the museum was selecting these artworks, right? And they're calling them out. They're saying only 5% are women artists, and yet 85% of the artworks you selected are of women nude. So is that what we have to do for women artists to get into the Met, is to be naked? They got funded by the New York Public Art Fund, and it was supposed to be a billboard. And that got rejected as too risque. So then they decided to buy advertising space on the New York City buses. And they actually got them on the buses. So this huge picture that covered the length of the bus on multiple buses was driving around New York for a while. Eventually, it didn't get renewed, though, because they felt like this was too phallic, I guess, probably not the whole thing. This part here, that was what they were arguing. It looked too phallic. So even they had to deal with censorship when doing this as well. They later donated it to the Met and ends up being featured in an exhibition later called Prints: Revolution, Resistance, and Activism. So what's funny too with this is that like a lot of the artwork that challenged the other museums and the system that had some resistance to it ends up later in years later getting featured in some of the galleries and stuff, which I mean is still good because it gets exposure. They also then expanded to look at racial discrimination, and also just increase portfolios on posters and things that they did. They published 30 posters in 1987, and also had the portfolio was entitled "Gorilla Girls Talk Back." This is a popular one that they created. We sell white bread. This was made to, again, widen their focus to include racial discrimination in the art world and be more direct on political issues. This image was on this poster was first seen as a peel-off sticker on gallery windows and doors in New York. So they specifically put this as stickers on specific galleries. to target and call out the galleries, and then eventually became a larger poster as well. So it's we sell white bread, ingredients, white men, artificial flavoring, preservatives, contains less than the minimum daily requirement of white women and non-whites. Right? So that tongue-in-cheek again. And then here you can see, here's they actually create, so they're still around today. This is their book. So they in 2020, I think, this is that they created the book, Guerrilla Girls, The Art of Behaving Badly. They also, this is actually from the 2000 and, I forgot the dates, 2007, I believe. A woman is president if women want it. More women have voted than men in every presidential election since 1984. Vote, right? So then you have the woman with on the podium with the presidential seal in a suit, but wearing the gorilla mask, making a point that technically, if all women, we're not obviously not a monolith, we don't all agree on the same things, but they are making the point that if enough women really wanted a woman president, we could have it, because women vote more than men, and if we mostly voted the same way, whatever women voted for would happen. That's what that one is saying there with that. So they're still active today. They're still a presence. They have spread out to Instagram, creating a book. They still are challenging the exclusiveness of the art world. The quote from them says, "Artists should stop making art only for the 1% and start making art for the rest of us." They also continue to fight for representation and rights for everyone. In their own words, they said, this is one of my favorite quotes, "How can you really tell the story of a culture when you don't include all the voices within the culture?" Again, how can you really tell the story of a culture when you don't include all the voices within that culture? All right. Sorry, this one was longer and it went a little bit over what I was hoping to for timing, so I will end it there. We will look at part 2 in the next one.